let's jump to the agenda, which is to highlight the fact that Arif is going to be kicking us off to go over Spark code debugging capabilities within Databricks before moving on to performance troubleshooting. And then I'll take over from there to highlight exploratory analysis capabilities. Arif, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thanks, Philip. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so what I want to do is kind of break this up into a few different sections as just a quick introduction to how you do code debugging in general, but more specifically Spark troubleshooting in Databricks. So I think the first thing that we want to cover, it'll be somewhat trivial, but I think they're worth highlighting, which are just common error types that we run into when coding in general and how you would handle those in Databricks. So for those of you who are used to coding in notebooks or just used to using IDEs in general, a lot of this will kind of be very straightforward and very much what you're already used to. But then I want to highlight some tools that are specific to Databricks. So some tools that that Databricks offers that allows you to kind of take debugging to the next level. So when you get beyond just basic syntax errors and being able to use the output that you get directly in the notebook, you need to dig a little bit deeper. So I'll talk about some of the debugging tools. I'll also talk about other useful features, even if they're not specific to code debugging, but that just allows you to be able to kind of step through your code and make it a little bit easier to develop code to avoid errors. And then finally, I'll kind of end the session with a brief introduction to the Spark UI and talking a little bit about when you want to leverage that. So first, let's talk about some of the common error types. So I would break this up into 4 different sections. So you have your basic syntax errors. This is what everybody's used to, right? And the way that you're going to debug this is similar to the way that you would debug it in most notebook environments. But if you never used a notebook before, then a quick kind of introduction is that you have kind of your code development, your markdown, and your kind of IDE feedback all in one place. So if I'm running this code here and I have a syntax error, we see if I run it with no syntax error, then I just get a successful execution. If I run this with a syntax error and I just get rid of my quotations here, I'll just get a basic error message. And then again, if you worked in notebook environments, this will be familiar. You can see your entire Python trace. This will tell you exactly where the code occurred, and you can just kind of do basic debugging like you would in any other IDE. So that's kind of the most basic example. But I did want to highlight some others as well that we see quite a bit. Because you're working on top of a data platform, a lot of times you're going to see errors that may have to do with permission errors, right? This will show up just like any other syntax error, but instead it's telling you that you don't have permissions to the data that you're trying to access. So obviously when you see those, you want to reach out and make sure that you have the proper entitlements to access that data. We also see a ton of reference errors. Again, if you've coded before, this may seem pretty straightforward, but this is, let's say you're trying to reference a table that's in a different database, right? And you forget to specify the database name. So that's one thing to look out for. And then finally, one of the cool things about notebooks is the ability to be able to jump back and forth between languages. But I've seen quite a bit where sometimes you'll forget maybe that you're in a Python notebook and you'll try to run some SQL. And maybe it'll take 10 minutes to realize, oh, this SQL isn't executing because it thinks that it's Python. So these are kind of, really basic examples that hopefully will save you 10 to 15 minutes in the future just by keeping them in mind. But I want to go a little bit more detailed in terms of, when you're really trying to do some serious debugging, what tools do you have available? So the first that I want to talk about is the Python debugger. So I'll show you an example of that. Here I'm just defining a class inside of Python. I have some variables. I'm doing, some things that maybe aren't that straightforward. So if I run this and I get an error, I may want to actually, try to figure out, what exactly is causing this error. So one of the tools that I can leverage is actually our Python debugger. And we could either call that debugger or we could just turn it on by default. So if we run in the first cell, PDB, which is with Python debugger on, and I run this code again, I'll see that this code will now execute. I'll still get my error, but now I actually have my IPython debugger available to me, and I can start to step through this, right? So I can start to say, Okay, I want to take a look at some of the variable values to try to figure out why I was getting this divide by zero error. So let me take a look at correct and see what the value of that is. So I can step through, I can see, okay, that's 10, that's what I expect. How about the value of total? And I can see, okay, well, that value of total is 0. I'm dividing correct by total. Okay, that's obviously going to get me a divide by 0 error. So let me go ahead and I can use the U command to go up one level in the stack. And I can say, okay, let's go ahead and see what the value of self.total is. What value am I actually passing in there? So here I can see that I'm passing in 0. Okay, that's a problem. So let me take a look and see why I'm passing in 0, because that's not expected. And here I can see quickly that I'm actually hard coding self.total to 0. So, pretty obvious. But if you have a ton of code on your screen, maybe that's a little bit harder to find. So I can then just change that so that instead of hard coding it, like everything else, I'm just referencing it. So now if I run this again, I can go ahead and interrupt this, run this again, and see if my code executes successfully, and it does, and it gives me the expected output. So that's a cool tool that you have available to you. Another one that I'll highlight quickly is the Variable Explorer. So this is another tool that you have kind of natively inside of the Databricks UI. So I'm going to go ahead and run all of this code. I'm just going to define a bunch of different variables of different types. So variable 1 is a string, variable 2 is a dictionary object, variable 3 is an int, right? And now, again, imagine, I have a notebook with a ton of variables defined all over the place. Maybe this is someone else's notebook that they recently shared with me. And I want to know, what are all the variables? What are their values? What are the data types? So I can actually just click over here and I can see my entire variable explorer. I can actually start to filter. So let's say I just want to take a look at the data frames. So I can see the types. I can see the current value that it's set to. So this is also a pretty cool feature. You can also just explore that variable. So here I can click on it and I can display that data frame. In this case, let me turn my debugger off. So this is also how I would turn my debugger off. But the variable explorer is also a really, cool tool that you can kind of quickly step through various different variables, see everything that's being referenced inside of that notebook, and quickly be able to identify the data types to make it a little bit easier to kind of figure out what's going on with your code. Okay, so now what I want to do is just highlight some of the other features that are available. So if we go out of debugging tools, let's look at some other useful features that you may want to leverage as you're trying to make sure that you avoid errors in your code and you're developing inside of Databricks. So one is just the ability to be able to highlight text. So this is, again, if you work in an IDE, this is something that you probably get accustomed to and you expect, and it makes it a little bit easier to develop your code. So let's say I have a cell with multiple lines and I just want to run line 1. So I could either use the shortcut, which is going to be Control Shift Enter, or I can go ahead and just click on Run, and then I can just run selected text. So it only prints line 1 instead of printing line 1 and line 2. Basic feature, makes life a lot easier. Another feature that I'll highlight is the ability to be able to, use automated code formatting. So if you want to quickly clean up your code, you kind of write sloppy code, you want to clean it up, then you can use a shortcut to automatically format your code. So I'll show that. That's just Control Shift F. And then the other thing that I'll show is what we were seeing here, which is the error highlighting. Again, those of you who work in IDEs, you may be used to this. This is also a nice feature where even before you run your code, you can start to get some indications as to whether or not it's valid or not. Okay, so last thing I'll show is the Spark UI. And I'll kind of just preface this by saying the Spark UI itself is definitely a vast topic. What I want to do today is just kind of introduce you to what it is and introduce you to why you would need it, when you would use it, and then how show you a couple of resources that you can leverage to get familiar with it. By all means, if you want to go a little bit deeper, You can leverage some of the resources that I'll highlight, but you can also reach out to the Databricks team so that we can do a dedicated session. And honestly, performance tuning is probably, a 1 to 2 hour session on its own. So quickly, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Spark UI, just want to kind of talk about Spark architecture in general. So everything kind of starts off with the application. That then breaks up into jobs, which breaks up into stages. The stages then break up into tasks, and each task is owned by an executor. The executor is what actually executes that particular task. So that's going to be helpful context when we take a look at the Spark UI so that you kind of understand what we're looking at. So when would we use this? When we go beyond just basic syntax errors, right, which we're going to get that output directly in the notebook, and we can troubleshoot as we were seeing earlier. But let's say we go beyond that, and we actually are not trying to troubleshoot syntax errors, but we want to try to figure out why we're having performance issues, right? So we really want to kind of dig deep into the Spark jobs and try to figure out, where are the bottlenecks and where can I kind of clean up the way that I'm doing things to speed up my jobs, to speed up my code. So that's what I'm going to show here. And I'm actually going to introduce you to a really, really cool tool, the Spark Simulator. So this is a nice tool that all of you actually can access right now. It's a publicly available tool. And I'll just go ahead and put that link in the chat so that everyone has it. And if you want to play around with that a little bit later, you can. And I'm just going to show you the first example here in the Spark Simulator, which is exploring the Spark UI. So this is just a simulator that kind of steps you through a lot of the examples that you commonly see in Databricks. If we were inside of the notebook itself, we would access the Spark UI by just clicking on the view. We also could go, and if I go back to my notebook, we also could go to view and go to view Spark UI. Or if we're in a notebook and we run a Spark cell, we could click view directly here. Okay, so what I want to do is just jump into the Spark UI itself and kind of talk through some of the sections. So the first is the event timeline. To me, this is probably the most useful. This will show you jobs that ran, and this will show you how long it took to run each job. It will also show you the jobs that failed versus the jobs that are currently running and the jobs that succeeded. So I think this is the most useful, right? This is a nice visual representation of your code and kind of where those bottlenecks are and how Spark is breaking down what you're doing so that you can quickly identify, in this case, we don't have any completely outportion jobs, but let's say job 24, was taking a really long time. Now I could jump down and I could say, okay, what is job 24? And I could dive a little bit deeper and I could start to look at the different stages within job 24. And I can see which stage specifically is acting as the bottleneck so that I can then dive deeper into that stage and figure out, maybe there's a join that I'm doing, maybe there's a wide operation that I could optimize. And again, that Spark optimization would be its own topic. But I did want to introduce you to this as a tool so that you kind of know quickly, one, how to access it in Databricks, and then two, how to use it when you really need to kind of troubleshoot Spark performance. The last thing I'll kind of show you before I hand it back over to Philip is another nice component of this, which is this lab that can kind of talk you through all of these different experiments that we have here. So if you are interested in diving deep and understanding the different scenarios, the different performance bottlenecks that you run into, these labs are a really, really good exercise to walk through. And then again, the Databricks team is definitely open to doing a much longer form session to talk through Spark performance and the different ways to tune the performance in Spark. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Philip.
Excellent. Thanks, Arif. So the next part of this session is going to be going over and covering the exploratory data analysis feature within Databricks that's available directly in your notebook, where you can summarize all of your data set's essential properties and statistics in a data profile, and also be able to create the same interactive charts to visualize your data. So I'm going to share my screen here and take you to the Databricks UI. So here I'm in the notebook view from Databricks, and I've already prepared a notebook that has pulled out a variant of the previous query that I went over as part of the query profiling. And then whoops. Click on the wrong one. Give me one sec. And that is going to be stored here in the notebook. And so recall for that particular query, I was querying the records from the drug package and the FDA drug product tables. And there was an inner query and then there was an outer query. So I pulled that inner query and modified it so that I was also standardizing, normalizing the marketing date just to pull out the specific year. And so within your notebook, you can run that specific query. And by default, it's going to return back the results for the UI so that you can explore what some of those results look like directly in your notebook. From here is where you can start accessing other Explorer data analysis capabilities. So the first I'm going to be going over is looking at the data profile. So with the data profile, it's going to be taking all of the results that were returned from your specific query and calculating summary statistics on them based off of the quantitative fields and the qualitative fields of the results. And so as you can see here, it split those columns that the fields that I had pulled out into numeric and categorical. And you can use this data profiling tool to essentially just do a gut check and ensure that the data sets and the results look same. So things like looking at the package count as an example, recall that what I was pulling out was and retrieving was all of the drugs along with the different packages that they're available in, that the minimum number is 1, and here the max is 417. So there's a wide range. However, the median is 1, and really the mean is just 2.82. You can also use this to check other fields. And so here for the marketing year, the minimum is 1900s, and then the maximum is 2023. So this can be used to illustrate and conclude that the results that we have in this particular table only go back to the 1900s, which is when it was started to be tracked. Now, looking over at categorical features, you can look at the specific values that are the most prevalent. So an example here is it's finding that for the substance name of the products, that alcohol is the most prevalent. And for that, there are 3,452 instances of it. And so you can use that information to just do a gut check as well, knowing that, let's say, what are those records and why is the substance name alcohol? You can go back to the table, start to look through that specific field and then find those instances, right? So here, I'm showing this particular drug there, which is not clear, but if you go back to, if you keep on going down to other alcohol-related entries, they're around hand sanitizers. So the next feature is to look at visualization. So I won't spend too much time on this because Lindsay already covered this, but directly in your notebook, you have the ability to set up visualization as she did through the SQL editor itself. And so in here, for the data set, you can do things like select the column along the x-axis that you like to use, add columns, such as maybe like the labeler name as the Y for the y-axis, to be able to count the unique number of labelers that came out with a product on a yearly basis. And this is going to show you what that distribution looks like. And so from this particular panel, you can update your visualization by adding labels to your x-axis, y-axis, so on and so forth, to get to a point where you're happy with it and you can save it. And eventually, once it has been saved, add it to a dashboard as Lindsay did earlier. Okay, and with that, I'm going to pause there and turn it over to questions.